Brubaker, writer of, well, virtually everything that I've been reading for the past 20 years, at least when it comes to crime comic books. And welcome to Art Bubble.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us this way.
Yeah, no, this is the one good thing to come out of the pandemic is being able to do stuff like this and reach more people. That we always had this in front of us, I guess, for years, but we never thought about doing it until we had to.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I contacted you when we knew that Sean and Jake would be joining us for Art Bubble this year, and you
Yeah.
kindly agreed to answer some questions because we really wanted to make it the three of you.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish. Probably
When
better weather there, I hope.
it's been nice and warm, yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's been insane here. It was like a week of over 100-degree days.
Oof.
So yeah, miserable.
All right. Well, let's see if we can make it slightly less
Yeah,
miserable, at least by talking about some comic books.
great.
And I had the great pleasure of asking a fellow crime writer, not my fellow, but yours,
Oh,
Paula Schmidt, a
oh,
Danish crime author and artist, to write some questions for you. And I'm just going to go through
oh, great.
those questions, and we'll see how much
Okay.
of it we can manage.
I hope I live up to his expectations.
I'm sure. Now, you've of course been doing comic books for many years, and we
Yeah.
were wondering, what was it that attracted you to comics when you started out?
Um, well, I grew up reading comics. My dad had been a comic reader back when he was a kid in the 40s when comics first really blew up in America. And so when I was a very little kid, like 2 or 3 years old, my dad came home from work with this huge box of comics that he'd gotten from his friends at the office. He was in naval intelligence, and so he went into work one day. My brother was like 4, I think, and I was almost 3. And he asked his friends there if their kids had any comics they didn't want anymore. And so they all brought in a bunch of stuff. And so he just came home one day with this huge box and gave them to me and my brother. And ever since then, I was just obsessed with comics like my whole life. Like I was reading comics before I could read, really. I was like reading the pictures and trying to figure out what they were saying.
Well, that is well, what every kid dreams of, I imagine. I remember getting my own uncle's
It
comics.
was pretty cool. It was I remember the first comic I ever read was a coverless version of Fantastic Four #6. And I only know that because I just remember that they sent the Baxter building into the moon and it had like Submariner and Doctor Doom in it together. And then it was like there was all sorts of stuff. There was like Archie's and Richie Riches and old EC comics and all just beaten to shit from other kids having read them. But it was a great way to just really kind of get into it. And for a long time, I only wrote stories so that I would have something to draw. I didn't realize until I was probably in my like late teens or early 20s that I was more of a writer than an artist. Really, I just
Okay,
wrote stories so I would have something to draw.
right. So you started by writing for yourself in order to draw it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I spent my childhood just kind of making up my own versions of Marvel and DC characters and just making up adventures of them and drawing them myself, usually getting about 4 pages in before I gave up.
Okay, so you're obviously weaned on comic books, and good comic books by the sound of it. Uh, what about your crime noir influences? Where do they come from?
That was kind of a combination of things. My when I was a kid, my dad was obsessed with my uncle's old movies, and his sister was married to a screenwriter named John Paxton, who was a big screenwriter in the 40s and 50s and even through the 60s. And I think he was still working when I was a kid in the 70s. But he wrote like Murder My Sweet and and Crossfire and On the Beach and The Wild One. And so I grew up being taken to like noir fests and stuff from a time when I was much too young to understand, what the movies were about. But so I kind of, just grew up around those black and white movies and hearing the story of my uncle's career and stuff. And so I had that side of it as just part of my childhood culture. And then when I was a teenager, my friends and I were sort of into drugs and, sort of low level crime. And that, I think, planted the seed of realizing my way into crime stories was, from the point of view of the criminal a little bit. And then when I was just starting to get published as a cartoonist, I had friends asking me to write stories for them. And every story I came up with was like a crime story that was sort of real life based, but with like a murder or a crime or a robbery or something that goes wrong in it. It was very much like attracted to that noir space. And I think at the same time, I was reading a bunch of true crime books and had discovered all the Black Lizard paperbacks that were coming out in the late 80s, reprinting old Jim Thompson and James M. Cain and, all the really greats of the 40s and 50s. And so I was getting obsessed with all of that stuff and wishing that there was, more that could be done in comics like that. So I think for my whole career, I've sort of been trying to find ways to jam, like crime or noir elements into whatever comics that I've been working on.
Yeah, and you started doing that fairly early on, I would venture. I remember, and I have it right over here, the scene of the crime.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Was that your first crime comic?
I think that was I when I was writing and drawing my own comics, I did a series called Low Life, and the second issue of that was like a autobiographical, like my life of crime kind of thing about like growing up being a petty criminal and then becoming a drug addict and becoming a worse criminal. Um, but Scene of the Crime was the first time I tried to do like, a sort of literary noir, murder mystery kind of thing. And that was heavily influenced by years and years of just reading Ross McDonald and Raymond Chandler and, Hammett and stuff like that. And I really wanted to try and do a character like that, like a good guy detective who was sort of from my generation, which at the time I was young. And there weren't a lot of young detectives really out there, so I thought I'd try and do something like that. I pitched that idea after about a year of not selling things to Vertigo. At the time I had been pitching projects and not landing anything, and then I remember my editor Shelley asked me, well, what do you really want to do that you think we won't do? And so I just wrote up the pitch for Scene of the Crime like the next day and sent it in, and it got approved like a week later. And I was like, oh, what happened? like I thought for sure this was the kind of thing you weren't into. And they only did one miniseries, so they weren't super
Yeah.
into it. But it really, it set me sort of on a path and helped me cement my name in comics as somebody who wrote good crime stories.
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to be embarrassing that I can't remember who started drawing it, because I know Sean came
That's
in
Michael.
later.
Yeah, Michael Lark. Yeah,
That's Mike
Michael.
Lark.
Michael
Yeah.
drew it, and Sean. Michael drew it and inked the first part of it, and then
Mm,
he was unhappy with his inks, and he wanted something more
mm.
loose. So he asked Sean if Sean would come on and ink the rest of it, and that was the first time I ever worked with Sean at all. This is in the old days when we barely even emailed with people. Like we would get packages in the mail from the editor of Xeroxes of pencils and things like that. Like email has changed everything.
Yeah, I can imagine. But yeah, I saw Mike's name earlier, because he'll be at LickHalf this year. So I don't know why I blanked out on it, but I know that that was the first project where you got involved with Sean.
Yeah.
And of course now your collaboration is close to legendary in the comics industry. Um, so from Scene of the Crime, and then moving like towards where we are now, what was it that made you choose Sean to be like your illustration vehicle for these stories? Was it for you that just clicked and after 20 years still works so well?
Um, I mean, originally, I think I really had loved his drawing before I ever met him or worked with him. I just loved the stuff he was doing on Hellblazer, and I loved how he was able to have like a kind of a raw line to the way he inks things sometimes. Like sometimes, I mean, his chart's always changing a little bit here or there, but he has the ability to, ink something like Munoz or Pratt or something like that. And but at the same time, like there's a lot of really great comic artists that I don't empathize with the characters that they draw. Like I don't feel anything about the characters that they draw. But when I noticed the first time Sean and I collaborated on a thing for DC called Gotham Noir, it was like a 40s period piece. All the silent character moments really, really landed. Like you could really feel the emotion in these characters. And I just thought, oh, this is amazing. Like you don't get this with so many artists. Like you just don't feel the emotion of the characters. And for me, that's the most important part of what Sean does. He's a fantastic storyteller. He can draw anything that I ask so far. After 20 years, he's still surprising me. But I empathize with those characters, like, and so I know the readers will too. They'll feel for these people, especially when I have people doing really awful things a lot of the time. Like I want you to understand why someone would get pushed into a situation like that or feel desperate, and he's able to bring that stuff across, from when I ask for someone to seem unemotional to when I ask someone for someone to be like breaking down. Like he can make it all feel right. And he's just a master of the form as a storyteller and an inker. I just love to look at his work.
Oh, that's fantastic. I read somewhere recently that the two of you very rarely meet,
Yeah.
and even very rarely communicate, maybe via phone or like this.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, we do the odd like interview on Zoom together now and then, but yeah, we've probably met less than 10 times maybe in our lives together. I mean, we've spent weeks wandering around together, but then there'll be years in between.
right.
The last time I saw him, he was here in LA like a year or so before the pandemic. And but yeah, we just email all the time.
Mm.
I think I called him once because I hadn't heard from him for a few days and I was worried that he'd had a heart attack or something.
Yeah, unfortunately, those things do happen. So I'm glad
Yeah, we've been
somebody's
working
watching
together
out for
long
you.
enough that
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm more in line for one than him.
Oh, I hope not.
I hope not too.
So with the fact that okay, you communicate via email, but considering the distance between you, the cultural differences between England and the U.S., um, now how much liberty do you give Sean? How much string do you give him in terms of, yeah, the storytelling, as you were saying, you enjoy his storytelling work. So how's your procedure working together?
We pretty much do the same thing we've always done, which is, I just write the script. I'll send him, sometimes scene by scene, sometimes, a bigger chunk of script, but, I'm always sending him 6 or 8 pages of stuff, and he just reads it over and starts drawing. Sometimes I'll tell him like, oh, this is a wide shot or this is a full tier. Sometimes I'll be like, these 3 panels are one tier and they're all the same angle. But I write for him sort of how I used to write for myself. And when I write for other people, I tend to put more detail into what I'm describing because I know that I don't know what they're going to do. Whereas with Sean, I feel like we're such good collaborators that like I don't always know what angle he's going to choose, but I basically know, okay, he's going to draw this thing that I've asked for.
Mm.
And otherwise, he sometimes he'll divide like one panel into two panels, or he'll, choose to do something that's, different than I pictured it. But usually I'm always like, oh, that's cool. Like sometimes I'll end up cutting out dialogue or narration from a scene because I realize like, oh, the way he drew it, I don't need any of that. But yeah, it's pretty much simple the way we've always done it. Like I just mail him stuff, and then every week I get like pages from him in the mail. Every couple of days I'll get an email from him with pages that I can look at, and it's like this ongoing collaboration where we're sort of fueling each other. Every time I get a batch of pages from him, I always find it so inspiring to like finish whatever thing I was struggling with. I'm like, all right, well, he's going to need more pages soon, so I have to finish. So it's really, this thing we've been doing for 20 years now, where we just, I hope I inspire him as much as he inspires me.
Well, that's very sweet of you to say, and I would imagine so. I mean, reading the stories is absolutely fantastic, um, and there's just so many of them that I haven't even gotten through them all yet.
Yeah, we've been at it a while. We put out about 2 books a year
Yeah,
usually.
exactly.
So when we've been doing it 20 years, so I realized if you just look at our projects, it's like that, even that, if you don't separate them down into how many books in each project, it
Mm,
can get daunting. Like there's 10 criminal books.
yeah,
There's already 5 reckless books.
I know.
You know?
I was just seeing them in the comic book shops here in Denmark
Yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah, the 5th one comes out in like a month, I think. So
Okay,
yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, we'll have to pick that up there. Um, I'm seeing Sean in a month again in England, so
Oh,
that should
okay.
be possible. Now, I've deviated slightly from Palace questions, but we've covered a fair bit of it. But now you also write both for television and for film, as well as comics. Um, how does that differ? When of course it obviously is very different than when you're working with Sean, but how is your process then for other media?
Well, it's more it's not as much fun as comics, for one thing. Like I've been doing comics my whole life, like since I was a little kid. So I feel like comics is, as much my first language as, English is in some ways. So I feel like just gut instinct wise, I'm just better at comics than I'll ever be at anything else. Like I think I'm a good screenwriter. I do a lot of it. But and I've certainly, working on the TV show I did on Amazon with Nicholas Ruffin, I did, I think I covered the amount of rewriting that anybody needs to do to be like a master craftsman. but but there's so many other people's opinions going into everything, and sometimes it's not just an opinion, sometimes it's you have to do this,
Mm,
and you're working with so many other people. On like a TV show, you have a writing staff of 10 people, and then you have, one or two showrunners usually who are really in charge. So sometimes you're just helping someone else build their story and then writing part of it. Like I just did I was the head writer for Bruce Timm's new Batman show. And so doing that was like I helped run like a writing room, and then when everybody worked on their outlines, I like did rewrites on the outlines and sent them back. And and then when they turned in scripts, I would do like polishes on the scripts and then send them to Bruce for him to give feedback on or rewrite things. And so it's a much different process. Like I feel like a lot of screenwriting is more about like the technical skills of it, and I do actually like screenwriting. I love writing dialogue that actors are going to say. I love taking a scene that isn't quite working and figuring out a way to pull it together and make it land. But it's just I feel in a lot of ways like it's a much more technical job. It's hard to have the same kind of emotional attachment to the material that I do with my comics. Because with the comics, it's me and Sean and, our colorist who is Sean's son, for the last like 4 years now. So 5 years. So it's a very small unit that are, making the thing. And when you're in a TV show, you know, sometimes you're not even in a position of power at all, you know, even when you are like the showrunner or the head writer or whatever, like there's still other people who are going to say, oh, I didn't really like this, or I didn't understand this, or could you change this part, or can we make this part more obvious, or you know. And so you have to learn how to deal with a lot of that, or what to fight back on, or where that, you know, you have to go, okay, maybe they have a point. And you know, it's all the stuff you do in your head when you're writing a comic. You know, it's like you have a full writer's room in your head kind of when you're writing it. You're like, oh, this scene doesn't work. Like that's, I always tell people, all writing really is just calling bullshit on yourself over and over again until you're like, all right, I buy this. I can believe this scene, you know. So a lot of ways being in a writer's room just sort of makes you look at a story from a lot of different angles to try to make sure it's bulletproof, you know. So but yeah, like emotionally I just don't feel like I've yet to do anything in film or TV. So far I've only had stuff made in TV. You know, I haven't really done anything. I've done stuff where I'm like, oh, I'm proud of that, but I haven't done anything that I feel like carries that same kind of emotional resonance yet. And you know, but I think there's so few television shows that do that, you know. Now I realize like even getting a bad TV show or an unsatisfying TV show made is kind of a miracle, or a movie. Like making one that is also great, like a Breaking Bad or something like that, like those are just, you know, who the hell knows, like, you know, that's like a miracle on top of another miracle, where it's like, hey, all the pieces lined up and all the performances were great and nobody got in our way. And you know, so that's my dream, is to have one of our books turned into some, you know, a mini series or a TV show or a movie where it's actually like really good. In fact, I've killed projects when I feel like the script, I was like, oh, this script isn't good enough, like stuff I haven't adapted myself. um you know, because of course my scripts would be great. But you know, I actually really care about the quality of the work. So like I won't just like let a movie go forward if I think it's going to be a shitty movie, because I'm like, well, that's not going to help me at all. And that's,
Mm,
you know, if anything, that's going to hurt our brand of being
yeah.
good. You know, like I
And
feel
it
like if
is a
Sean and I
and
have
it
a
is a
brand
brand
at
now.
all, it's that
Yeah.
our brand is that we continue to work together and our work doesn't suck. So that's all I ask. Just make something that doesn't suck.
Well, that yeah, I'm not even sure how to respond to that. Make something that doesn't suck when it's up to you, and you're the writer's room and you're the editor and everything.
But
Because I
you can
also
still, you know, it's like you can be in the midst of a thing and watching it go wrong. There were many moments where I thought Westworld was never going to work at all, and that turned out to be a huge hit for HBO.
mm,
And you know, but when we were working on it, there were a lot of times where I was like, I don't know how they're going to pull this off. Like there's just so many, you know, you look at that list of people and it's like, holy shit, every head of every department better be amazing at their job. You know, it's daunting, you know, coming from comics to
mm,
having to work with that many people and rely on that many people. As a
yeah.
control freak, I'm really, you know, inspired to learn how to do it so that they actually do it the way I want them to.
Well, that's
Like
actually
if I could get that kind of control in a TV show or a film, I'd be very happy.
well, it actually makes for an interesting segue, saying that you're that big a control freak. Again, in terms of the influence that Sean brings to the work. Now, you mentioned earlier that he will do a panel slightly different, split up a panel if necessary, and so on. Um, I also seem to recall just recently having read that you are able to just pitch anything you want to Image. So
Oh yeah,
how
we don't
much?
pitch, we just tell them what we're doing.
See, there you
Yeah.
go. Um, Complete control.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
how much does Sean, like? Okay, you send him the script and he just brings it every time, obviously. But does he make any suggestions? Does he take liberties that you think, oh, maybe you shouldn't have done that, but okay, it
uh,
works.
Not really. I mean, he'll make suggestion. He won't make suggestions to a script as I'm writing it. Like if early on, if I'm telling him, oh, I was thinking about writing this, like a story like this or like that, you know, like he might say, "Oh, well, can we do can we do a romance, or can we do a western or something like that?" Like he'll make broad suggestions like that, or like he's asked me a bunch of times to write a sci-fi for him, and I just don't have any ideas. Um, but generally, he doesn't get into the granular. I think he's like the first reader of the script, so as long as he's happy with it, I feel like I'm doing it right because so far so good. But yeah, no, he doesn't really give that kind of feedback. I think for both of us, once we get into one of our graphic novels, like now we pretty much exclusively just do graphic novels for the
Mm,
last like 4 years. And once we get moving on it, a lot of it for us, I think, is about the momentum of just continuing to move forward. And
mm,
so for me, a lot of my weekly inspiration to keep writing, the rest of the book is seeing Sean's pages, and then sometimes he'll draw a scene and there'll be a character in it that I didn't realize was gonna, come out the way that he drew them. And I'm like, oh, I like that character. I'm gonna use that character more. Like stuff like that.
okay.
Like the way he's approaching the story. Cause I have usually like a rough outline that I'm sort of tightening as I go along, a few chapters at a time or a few chunks of a few scenes at a time. Like I'll get to a point where it's like, okay, I don't have the rest of this outline, but I know where it's going, and then I'll stop and go back to my notebook and do some more work. So sometimes that gives me the flexibility of reacting to his art that way, where it's like, oh, I like the way he drew that car, I'm going to add that car to more things, like stuff like that is really more of our process. But yeah, I think we both really just like to kind of put our head down and do our part of it and see what the other person comes up with.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like that the collaboration comes more in the form of, yeah, you giving him chunks of script, and then um,
Yeah, like we never
him
talk through a
responding to
story.
that, and then you adapt the script.
Yeah, like he never really, we don't sit down and talk through like here's what the story is going to be all the way through to
Mm,
the end. Like sometimes I'll tell him the gist of it, like, oh, this is going to be about, this girl from his past who comes back and wants him to, help her find this money that's missing, and then it goes, completely nuts, and he'll be like, all right, send me a bunch of pages.
uh,
And so it's at this point we've been doing it for so long that I think we just trust each other.
yeah, it certainly looks that way. And now you've brought in, well, he brought in Jake as well,
Yeah.
and well, I've been meeting Sean and Jake several times over the past couple of years,
Yeah.
and it's been really wonderful to see him grow as an artist. I mean, Jake, of course,
Yeah.
Sean being still growing, but also having had a
Yeah.
longer
Yeah.
career. What's it been like for you getting Jake involved in the books?
Well, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's funny in a way because Jake is probably like our sixth or seventh colorist. But again, I'm like, I, Jake feels like part of the family. Obviously he is Sean's family, but I feel like even though I only met Jake for the first time, 7 or 8 years ago, I grew up seeing him in our comics, or he grew up in our comics. Like anytime Sean needed someone to pose for a little boy or a little girl, it was always Jake in whatever outfits and stuff. So I'd seen Jake. He was like Sean, the only one of Sean's kids who was always happy to pose for photos for the art. And now he's actually coloring our book. So it feels great. And it's like my biggest fear is that Jake becomes so popular as an artist on his own that he won't make the time for coloring our books. But I
Well, that
really feel like he's, honestly, I think he's up there in like the top colorists in the field. And I think his first job as a comic book colorist was My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies. And I've had other colorists, like acclaimed colorists in comics, come up to me and tell me that that was the most bold debut of any colorist in the history of the field, to color outside the lines in their first job, to go impressionistic. Like it's kind of amazing. So I love the way he chooses like a palette for each scene, and how he doesn't really care about staying in the lines, and it's more about the mood.
mm,
um that's just a much different style than especially American comics are used to.
yeah. And now he's, of course, he's a full blown artist in his own right with Chip Zdarsky and Chris Carter. Nope,
Yeah,
not
he's
Chris
got
Carter,
his
Chris Condon.
yeah, he's got two of his own books going.
Hmm.
It's insane.
Yeah, no wonder you're wondering if you'll keep coloring
Yeah.
as well.
Well, also that product, the productive Phillips gene runs in the family. He's like, I think there was a point where I felt like Jake was coloring our book and drawing like 2 or 3 books on the side that he was also coloring and lettering. I was like, how the hell is he? Does he sleep ever? I guess he's young still. So,
That's true. That's a very good question. How does he do it? Maybe there are
yeah,
two of them.
yeah.
Now we're almost running out of time, and while I do have several more questions, I'm gonna stick to the limit that Zoom gives us,
Oh, okay.
unfortunately.
Oh,
Um,
I see that. Yeah.
but I do have two questions that I'd like to like get into from Pala. One of which is if your work process has changed, your workflow or writing process has changed over the years.
Um, I mean, it's always changing a little bit because every time you finish something, whether you're happy with it or unhappy with it or whatever, hopefully you're happy with it. But every time you finish something, you have to figure out what the next thing is you're writing. And suddenly, like all the confidence and everything that you've done before, it's like, I can't remember who said it. Maybe Dan Harmon or somebody said the reason writing is a hard job is because even if you're good at it, every time you finish something, you're back to the start again, and you're like, oh, I've got to do this all over again now. I've got to start a new one. How do I do this? It's like you're always attacking it from a different way. When we changed to doing graphic novels instead of doing single issue comics that are then collected in trade paperbacks or hardbacks, that was a real shift for our whole method, in a way, being able to just make the scenes as long as I wanted them to be, make the books as long as I wanted them to be, and not worry about having an artificial cliffhanger or not cliffhanger, but just some kind of satisfying chunk. um, that was starting to be a real struggle for me. Like I was always wanting more pages in everything that we did. So moving to graphic novels, I write a little bit faster, and Sean draws a little bit faster, because he doesn't have to stop, every month to draw a cover,
Mm.
figure out what the hell that's going to be, and so he just has to do a couple covers a year for us now, and then he can spend the rest of his time just drawing all the pages and figuring out the scenes and the storytelling and how he wants that to go.
Yeah, that sounds good. And now on just as we're about to end, if you had any one piece of advice for future comics creators, what would that advice be?
Oh boy. Um, I mean, it's a really hard field to work in. I guess all creative fields are hard to work in. It really depends. If you want to make a living in comics, you might have to go into the, work for hire fields for a while. But my biggest advice would always be to, figure out what it is that you actually want to, create as a writer or an artist, and try to spend as much of your early years of your career focusing on that, as well as if you're doing work for hire at the same time, try to always juggle your personal with the earning money part of it. But really, your biggest focus should always be like, what is the book that you need to be making right at that moment? And if you can focus on that instead of worrying about what people want or what you think will sell, then you're going to end up a lot happier regardless of your level of success. Because I know plenty of incredibly successful people who never wrote the things that they wanted to write, and they're not happy even though they're rich. So, and I know lots of sort of mid-list crime writers who are very happy in their life as a writer because they just write the stories they want to write. So, I think, you learn to judge your levels of success in your career as a writer, and you have to sort of find your own happiness regardless of where the money is. I think you have to really write what's passionate inside you, and I've found when you do that kind of stuff, that's the work that people end up responding to the most, is all the stuff that you thought no one else was ever going to like except you. So
There we go. final words from Ed Brubaker. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed. It was
Oh yeah,
wonderful
thanks for
talking to
having
you.
me. Thanks for having me. Have a
You're
good
very
convention.
welcome. Thank you.